So we'll go ahead and just get started with the agenda for the night. Oh, I hear a small friend joining us. For the viewing public, my name is Jessica Sutter. I'm the Ward 6 representative on the DC State Board of Education. Oh, I see her small friend. And hello, friend. And also the facilitator for the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. Tonight is our final meeting of 2020, and we are going to spend time tonight talking through public comment received and working towards a final set of guiding principles that will forward to the State Board of Education for adoption on December 16th, and which will be forwarded on to the State Superintendent of Education for their work as they assemble a technical writing committee in the months ahead and begin the process of reviewing and revising the DC Social Studies standards. We have many of our SISAC members with us tonight. There are a few folks who reached out to say they were unable to join us. A few folks also will be joining us a little late, and several have sent their comments in ahead of time. Tonight we have three main objectives. We want to make sure that we can consider the public feedback we got on the guiding principles. We got more than 65 public comments, including some quite detailed feedback from external stakeholders and interested parties to the social studies standards. We'll talk through any open questions we have about the existing guiding principles. I've outlined a few that I hope we'll talk about in detail, but there'll also be an open period for any members of the SISAC to raise outstanding questions, concerns, or wonderings they still have. And then we will aim to finalize our guiding principles to prepare them to be handed off to the State Board for a public vote on December 16th and for forwarding on to the State Board of Education. Our SISAC members are listed here. They're also on the State Board website for folks who are interested in the public. We have the same norms for this meeting. I think our hope tonight is actually to get to some closure. So while we've often talked about non-closure, and there may be things tonight that folks don't feel fully resolved on, our hope is to get to closure on the guiding principles so that they can move forward and be passed to OSSE. And so I hope that folks will bring the best energy that we could hope you to have as we enter winter and it gets darker and we're still in month 9 of a pandemic. But I appreciate the energy you all have brought to the process, and I hope to see some of that tonight. We'll go ahead and dive right in so we can maximize our time in discussion. We had a lot of public feedback, and one of the first opportunities we had to share some of that public feedback and to have discussion about it was at the State Board working session on December the 2nd. And we were very lucky to have 2 members of the SISAC join us to present the work of the SISAC, reflections they had as members of the SISAC, and to engage in discussion of some of the public feedback with members of the board. Fidel Moore, Maria Marble Bunch, and Sally Schwartz were all volunteers who had agreed to come. Sally, unfortunately, was unable to join us on that Wednesday evening, but Fidel and Maria did a beautiful job representing the SISAC, talking through their own reflections as members, and engaging in really spirited discussion with members of the board about questions they had about the work we've all taken part in, as well as opinions or thoughts on how the work had proceeded. So Maria and Fidel, I see you both here. If either of you would like to say some things about that experience, I would be happy to open the floor. Please don't feel pressured because we didn't ask you to prepare anything for tonight, but if you would like to reflect, we'd love to have you do so.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity. It seems like the school board, just so everybody, seems to be largely pretty down with what we've put forward. So we can definitely, I think we can like move forward with like a spirit of cooperation with this. I also brought up the point I know a lot of people were concerned about at our last meeting, or was the meeting before that, about like the practicality of having teachers be on the technical community. I brought that up to the school board, and a lot of people, including Jessica, seem to really take up that charge and really wanted to see what they can do to make sure that that happens, because they seem to agree that that's very important to have current teachers writing the standards who are from DC and look like DC, because otherwise our work would be for naught.
Agreed. Thanks, Fidel.
For me, it was good to get their feedback directly. And overall, they were very impressed, enthusiastic about what has been produced so far. And is looking.
Someone may not be on mute who is not speaking at the moment. So if you are not speaking and you are not on mute, if you'd put yourself on mute, that will be helpful. Go ahead, Maria.
Okay. So for me, the overall result of it all was just hearing the feedback and to hear the enthusiasm from them about what we have been able to do in such a 7-month period of time. They feel that we have given them enough that now they can move on to the next phase of writing the curriculum. So I left feeling very positive and feeling very good about all the work that everyone has been doing to get to this point.
Sorry, I was trying to get back to my unmute button. Thank you, Maria. I would agree, as a member of the board who was there during that discussion, I really think it was a valuable conversation for members of the SISAC and members of the board to have the chance to engage. And I agree. I think our board is excited about being able to advance your guiding principles to OSSE. We have a draft resolution that is under consideration by our board, which will essentially form sort of a cover sheet to the resolution. It'll be something we write and we vote on that will accompany your guiding principles. And one of the key elements of it, you can see our draft resolution on our state board website. Perhaps one of our staff might even find it and drop it in the chat. We have clauses that talk about why we're doing this in the resolution. They're they're whereas clauses. And then we have now therefore be it resolved clauses, which talk about what we're actually doing in the resolution. And our now therefore be it resolved, the first clause is we're adopting the guiding principles that you all have created, and we're advancing those to OSSE for use by their technical writing committee. So we're very excited to take that up on December the 16th. And tonight, our work before this advisory committee is to get that set of guiding principles finalized so that they can be handed off to the OSSE in their totality. What I thought we would use the next roughly 35 minutes to do is walk through the public feedback we got that is in the Google Doc that you all had links to in your email. And we'll walk through the public feedback that we received. Alex and I spent time with the public feedback, actually dropping it in line in the document to the places people wanted it to correspond to. We received 60, correct me if I'm wrong here, Alex, but I think 69 responses to the Google form, and then several letters and emails, maybe 4 to 5 letters or emails in addition to those responses that gave more detailed feedback. So all of that is what we dropped into the document so that you all can see that, and you have a link to the Google folder where all that feedback can be found. What I've pulled out tonight are a couple of key pieces of feedback that I hope we can talk through and consider as a committee. And then when we get through all of that, I want to make sure that any feedback I haven't called out specifically, but that is important to you, or any additional feedback you all have, we also have substantial time to talk through any of that. So we'll start with some of these pieces I've pulled out. In some of these places, I've made recommendations on how I would suggest the committee might consider moving forward. In other places, I don't have a strong recommendation and leave it to the committee to decide how we should address these pieces of feedback. But our goal tonight is to figure out what feedback to incorporate and get these guiding principles to a place where we can present them to the board. So in the preamble, you will see quite a lot of feedback. Some of it is very general. There are a lot of thoughts that people had about the guiding principles that did not pertain to a specific principle. And so some of that I tacked in the preamble. But a few very specific pieces of feedback seem to make the most sense to be considered in the preamble. The first is a wording request that a member of the public made. They requested that we change actors on a global stage to agents of change. I don't see Sally here yet, but Sally Schwartz knew she would be a little late and sent some comments ahead of time. And her comment was that she actually thought actors on a global stage was intentional in the way it was written and important to leave that way, so that students didn't just see themselves as change agents, but also part of a larger global system, rather than simply being Americans or DC students or some sort of more localized presence. So that's one thing I hope the committee will consider. The second thing is that folks talked about the fact that we don't mention assessment, but that questions around how we assess what students know and are able to do at different points in the curriculum, at different points in the standards, seemed worthwhile. And so a question I have, and I put these comments in the preamble as comment bubbles, is there any desire on the part of the committee to mention assessment in the preamble, whether we have any sort of position or opinion on this that we want to transmit to OSSE as part of these guiding principles? The last thing I'll say is that if any of the other comments that are in that document resonate for you, this would be a good time for us to talk about those, the ones that are sort of clumped up at the top in the preamble. So I'll be quiet and look for hands or comments that folks may want to put in the chat in response to any of those three: the wording request, the mention of assessment, or any other comments in the preamble that resonate for you all. Barbara, is your comment yes in response to assessment?
Yes, I was starting to type the rest of it. So I'll just jump in. I agree with Sally on the first one. I think that the shifting actors on a global stage to agents for change changes the meaning. I think that the purpose of actors on a global stage was the global part that is lost by eliminating that. So, but that more importantly to me is that I think it's a great idea. I'm sort of surprised that we didn't think about it ourselves earlier, but now seems as a good time to do so. If there's anything that, what gets tested gets taught. And social studies has long suffered from not having high stakes tests, and I think that's a big part of the reason why it's the sort of forgotten child of particularly elementary education. And I don't know what the solution is. I don't know, what specifically to recommend, but I would be strongly on the side of putting something in here about the importance of assessing these standards in time.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Sally, I see your hand up.
Yes. I want to go back to the actors on a global stage. Not that I'm so in love with that language, but I wanted to say a little more, add to what you said, Jessica. That was my phrase. And the reason I put that in is that in my work in global education, there is a too common attitude that for our students, global anything is really not for them. And I think the idea of learning about the world, understanding the connections in all its manifestations, the goal is to make students understand that they have a role they can play in the world, they can be part of the world, they can learn from the world, and this is all for them. Agents of change is great. It could even be added, but to me, it's just a narrower piece of helping students feel empowered to sort of take on the whole world. So that was my motivation behind it, why I would like to stick with something more general about our students being connected to the entire world in many different ways.
I'm seeing strong support for actors on a global stage in the chat. So it sounds like there is support for actors on a global stage to stay. And I'm curious about thoughts on assessment. I see Becca's got a comment in the chat and Daniel has his hand up. So I'm going to come to Daniel first, and then Becca, if you want to say more about your chat comment, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Barbara, when you mention assessment, are you talking, it sounds like you're talking about like a summative assessment. Was the comment though recommending like a summative assessment, or was it more formative assessment or some combination? I'm just curious kind of what direction you're leaning toward.
I guess I was directing myself primarily in the moment to a summative assessment. Though I think in time, it would be wonderful, you know, if there were other things developed. But yeah, I confess to not having knowledge of the history of such in DC. But you know, few states have high stakes social studies exams when we have them in other, you know, all other subjects, and fewer, and those that do have them, they're historically pretty ratty. So you know, there's work to be done in this area, but I simply can't imagine, you know, it's not going to get, particularly at the elementary grades, where, you know, you're clawing for time in the day to, you know, to teach these subjects, unless there's a signal sent from the state office about, you know, consequences. I think that there's a good chance it'll get, you know, that it'll get pushed to the side. You know, what
I guess I'm not opposed to, I think, a statement saying that they should be assessed in some way. It seems kind of pointless to make standards if you're not going to measure them in some way.
Right.
I guess I just am not sure kind of how strong a statement it should be, if we should advocate a certain approach to assessment at certain grade levels, et cetera. Those all seem like kind of big thorny issues.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think just a statement of sort of sentiment. I don't know that we have to get too prescriptive about it, at what grades and that kind of thing.
Has everyone taken a look in the Google Doc at the 3 comments on assessment? Because there are 3 comments and they are all a little different. That's part of the reason I stopped sharing my screen, was so I could go back and look at them specifically myself. The first one talks about assessments focused on document-based inquiry and connecting assessing the standards to ELA assessing. The second talks about progress on the standards as students move through the course of their learning, similar to the science standards and the science assessments, which is happening 3 times through the course of a child's education, K-12. And then the third comment was about an emphasis on critical thinking and how we evaluate the student standards on real learning versus performance on standardized tests. So that element actually goes against, I would say, a summative assessment in the way we have traditionally conceptualized summative assessments in DC, but does call out for some way to measure student learning of the standards. I'll say it all comes at a very interesting time, as I think states across the country are reimagining what assessment looks like and talking about the future of assessment. So I think the question is there anything the committee wants to say with respect to, is there a suggestion, a recommendation that there be a way to assess the standards at a statewide level? And if so, how do we want to phrase it? Or is that something we may want to avoid in the preamble and leave for discussion at another time? Scott, you've put a nice long comment in there. I know Becca also put a comment. Either of you want to say more about what you shared?
Becca, would you like to go first? I think your comment was first.
I'm sure. No, I think just as this is really illustrating how complex a question this is. And I like Barbara's idea of saying, basically acknowledging either within our preamble or in another document that, you know, like this is certainly like with new standards comes the questions of how to assess them. And that is something that, you know, we believe in or support, but yeah, having taught in a state with a very ratty, high stakes end of course test that was pretty much memorize like 300 people's names and hope you can remember them. Like, I do not think that strengthens teaching and learning in that state.
Yeah, I mean, I put some context in there, just that there is some research around the presence of statewide assessments, and that correlates with more instructional time in elementary in particular. So I do think that's something to consider. It almost makes me think though, that maybe is assessment part of like the things that we should be encouraging OSSE to consider beyond the standards themselves? Because I do think that assessment is one component of that, but it also makes me think of like professional developments and like adoption of new resources to support the standards. And so it makes me think of like, maybe is that, and I know maybe that's taking away from what the comments were intending, but I do think that if we actually want these standards to be more than just, words on a page, I do think that OSSE would probably need to do things like think about how assessments would be supported, how curriculum development would be supported, how professional development would be supported, on all those sorts of things.
Can I jump in and push back just on one thing, Scott? And that is, I mean, this, while, professional development, strong curriculum, all of that obviously is vital. The state's responsibility is standards and assessments, And so it almost, maybe what needs to go into the guiding principles, in the preamble to the guiding principles, as opposed to this potentially other language that talks about the importance of good curriculum and resourcing professional development and so forth, is some statement about, encouraging the writing committee that the standards need to be written in a way, that they are, that they can be measured, because it is our hope that in time, the district, the state would develop a test, signal the importance of this this discipline by developing a summative assessment with some, with some teeth to it, or something like that. I mean, that seems to me to be the appropriate role in a standards document, which is to say that we do expect that these standards will be measured, or that, yeah.
So I have sort of two questions on this. I think there's a couple of ways we can handle it. I am loath to, given the limited time we have for discussion tonight, suggest that we draft something, given the complexity of people's thoughts and opinions about this, that aims to be sort of quickly done and dropped in. But I think there's two other opportunities we have as a committee to provide input to OSSE. One is when the standards come back, as they're approaching a final draft, we can certainly provide feedback as to whether or not we think the standards are well suited for some sort of a state level assessment or not. I think the second thing is, as the OSSE writing committee is working next year, we are planning a few provisional quarterly meetings of the SISAC. 1 hour in March, 1 hour in June or July, 1 hour in September, and then a longer meeting in the winter, December likely, once we have a draft of standards from OSSE. One thing we could devote one of those meetings to is a conversation about assessments. How are assessments done in other states? Are there things you all find intriguing and interesting that might be part of follow-up work that we all recommend that OSSE take on as part of the rollout of these standards? General thoughts on putting something in this guiding principle versus sort of kicking the can down the road and using time in the year to come for that.
I like Barbara's idea of at least stating something that we'd like them to be measurable. I think that's been a complaint with the current standards, is that they're not operationalized in a way that it's easy to assess them, even in classroom level. Mm-hmm. So I think providing that guidance and then revisiting some of these kind of broader issues at a later date might be the best approach.
Other thoughts on that? Molly's got a set of suggested sort of comments in the chat.
I just was thinking a lot about these aren't just for the state to measure what kids are learning. It's important for teachers and schools to be able to adaptively measure how and what children are learning every day. And I think that like the comments from the doc talked about both content and like factual knowledge, but also how they're able to interpret documents and analyze. And I think that as the technical committee is writing, if they're able to keep that in mind, that the teachers, especially teachers and schools, need to be able to look at what kids are learning, how they are learning, what they're able to do with it. That's like really powerful. And then if that is going well and teachers are doing that well, then students will be able to take an assessment that OSSE decides to purchase or write, because the teachers and the schools have been able to assess and measure what their kids are learning in their classrooms every day. And like more than just both, because I think of like assessment as both like the factual things, like in Barbara's article I just skimmed, like kids don't know what the Declaration of Independence is for, like little factual, that's a little, but like factual things like that, but also can you read a primary source and analyze it? Like all of that. And I worry if we try to get too like, we need a state assessment, we're gonna end up with just like the 100 facts you have to memorize.
Yep. So far, it looks like there's some support for this language. So I'm going to leave that in the chat. I'm going to ask folks to tilt their attention for a second to any other feedback on the preamble that folks want to offer. And then any other feedback folks have on this suggested language in the chat. Is there anything else that was the feedback on the preamble that struck folks that is worth our consideration and discussion tonight? Or are we ready to move on to some of the feedback on specific guiding principles?
I would love to dive in. This is Jessica R. To some of the comments from the guiding principles.
All right.
The public comment.
I will. Sarah looks like she's also ready to move on, as is Maria. So I'm going to go ahead, and if folks want to keep talking about the preamble, let's keep that conversation going in the chat. We'll revisit it at the end. Let's move on to the next thing. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so we can talk about the next set of comments. Okay. So for guiding principle 4, we had put a note in prior to putting out for public comment. Karen Hopkins had noted that there was a discussion at one point about adding in exemplars and non-exemplars to the guiding principles to help give OSSE enough information to know what we meant when we said certain things. We're going to have a full conversation with this at the end, but all of that I think is particularly applicable to guiding principle 4, because one particular piece of public comment we got from ICS and the Jewish Community, I want to make sure I get the name of this right, Relations Council, they offered a few specific examples, and one of those is in the text of guiding principle 4. Alex Jew and I had a conversation in the comments there. I think that the level of detail that is offered here is likely too specific for a guiding principle, but would be seriously appropriate for an exemplar of what this guiding principle might mean. So we're going to have a conversation on guiding principle exemplars when we get to the end and to next steps, but I wanted to call that out here. Are there any questions from folks about guiding principle 4 or any of the comments that are there?
Wait, actually, Jessica, can I ask a logistical question?
Yeah.
So toggling back and forth between our draft of the guiding principles and then your draft of the public comments, where should I look for the specifics on this particular comment? Is that in your summary of the public comments, or is that already in our guiding principle draft? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to.
No, it's a great question. In the Google Doc version of the guiding principles, in guiding principle 4, you should be able to see the comment that Karen Hopkins has written my response to her comment, Alex Jew's insertion of the ICS and Jewish Community Relations Council's text, and then my response to his comment. So all that should be there.
Perfect.
And that way you do not have to toggle back and forth anymore. Everything I hope you'll consider tonight and that Alex hopes you'll consider tonight are in the document. Yeah, good, really good clarifying question. All right, then I'm going to move us to the next one and we can come back to number 4 if we need to. Guiding Principle 6 was unresolved at our last meeting. This is the guiding principle about including active voice in the standards. It was rated 3.43. So as we put out for public comment, we gave folks a Likert scale with 4 being the highest rating and 1 being the lowest rating. This is sort of a middle of the pack rating, but it was higher than 2 of the other principles we'll talk about tonight, 7 and 10. There were a few specific suggestions to be added to the wording, but by and large, people seem to like this guiding principle. One wording suggestion was around specificity and context, that if we don't also talk about the need for active voice and active voice language without talking about also precision of language and providing contextualization for what we mean in the standards, we may end up with less useful standards. There was also a suggestion, and this is also from the ICS and Jewish Community Relations Council, that we add in language about being explicit on the attention to discrimination against marginalized groups. So you'll see all of that in Guiding Principle 6. My suggestion is that we go ahead and include Guiding Principle 6, and we add in the text suggestions from public comment. Are there thoughts about another way to handle this? Any opposition to including Guiding Principle 6 or to including the recommended texts from public members of the public?
Is the recommended text what's in blue or what's highlighted there?
That's, yep. Seen a couple of comments in the chat. I don't see any hands. So I'm not sure if other folks have additional ideas about how to handle the language.
I like the language about being precise. I feel like the language didn't fully capture. So, but I'm wondering if with that, if we should change this to use of active voice and precise language to like capture that, like it's two things, like active voice is one part and precise language is the second part. Just a
I like that a lot. That improves it a lot for me.
Okay.
I don't know if it needs to say precise action words or if the whole thought is precise. Like I think it's more than the verbs, it's precise language and descriptions.
If we were to actually change,
I don't know.
Oh, Alex, I was curious if we're in there. That's awesome.
I like that Jessica Rudder, the piece about transparency about the canon incorporation of DC history. I think that's another thing that being specific is really important around.
All right. So it feels like I haven't seen any opposition to including 6 Folks feel good. Lamar's got a comment and Scott's got a comment about agreeing on the precision of language. So if we add in precise language, it feels like folks are okay with including guiding principle number 6 and advancing it forward. If folks feel differently, let's go ahead and put that in the chat. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next set of feedback on the guiding principles. And thank you, Alex, for being in the document and keeping the updates going there so that I don't have to toggle back and forth quite as much. Guiding principle 7 had quite a lot of comments, and I don't have as clear a recommendation here because there's quite a lot to think about. So there were a few specific text additions, and those you'll see in the guiding principle 7 in the blue-green text of some specific phrases to be added in. There was also a question, this is in a comment bubble, about whether there's a space to add in critical race theory into guiding principle 7. And then Sally, I believe this is your comment, a question around when we're talking about resistance and African-American history and the process of resistance in that telling of history, do we also need to, or should we in this principle talk about the inclusion of resistance in the broader African diaspora and how that connects to the history of African-American peoples? Thank you, Lamar, for noting that not everybody is seeing this sort of light blue-green that I see, that some folks are seeing it as brown or perhaps other colors. So you'll see that text in another color, but it might not be the color I mean. So let's walk through from the most specific suggestions to the more more open amorphous suggestions. Are there any questions or concerns about the suggested text additions where you've actually seen added text in guiding principle 7? Questions, opposition, concerns? And again, you can put it in the chat or raise a hand. Okay, seeing none. If you do still have questions, concerns, drop that in the chat or raise a hand. Sally, do you want to talk about your comment on inclusion about resistance in the broader African diaspora?
Yes, and actually more than the question of the wider diaspora, I mean, I just think that's always important to include when you're looking at race and the situation of African Americans. But my question about the word resistance in this standard, and it connected to some of the comments, like even the part about the role of churches, and I was wondering if the word resistance includes the creation of social and cultural institutions and sort of the, not just a political resistance, but I think I felt missing in this was the world that African Americans have made in this country in spite of. And it can be included in the definition of resistance. And if that's the case, I think it should be spelled out. That was my comment, because people were looking for there were suggestions about other kinds of content related to African American history. But it was hard for me to find that in what was written, except within this concept of resistance. So that was my thought about that word or this principle.
Reactions, agreement, questions? I saw some nodding, but I can only see about 6 people at a time. And I know lots of folks are just joining us with their voice tonight. So I want to make sure I'm not missing responses here.
Yeah, and I can add, and I said this in my comment to you, Jessica, that from from the outside looking in, what really defines American cultures has been very much the African American contribution. I mean, that's who we are as a country and a culture, whether it's jazz or whether it's so a part of who we are. So that aspect of culture and society, I just want to make sure it's in there. And I felt with the public comments, there were some people that were sort of searching for where that was. And I think it fits really well in this guideline. And it can be part of resistance to an oppressive society. The fact that, that African Americans created a culture and a society here so that's what I was sort of searching for.
Yeah, my question, Sally, is that there is a comment at the end, and you've brought this point up a few times, around the general sort of places where there's a need for more reference to culture and where culture appears to only come in once. So is it your thought that this is then also addressing that, or is there another place to really talk about the question of culture?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yes, exactly. And social organization, there were comments around community building. So again, it's sort of the creation of culture, the creation of society that comes out of a community. And it's not just African Americans, but that, to me, that is, the language can be interpreted as a reaction to all these specific things that are listed in the guideline. I just think it would benefit by being a little bit more explicit. So yes, it is kind of the cultural part. And I made reference to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. I mean, that addresses some of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
In addition to that's there. That's all.
Jessica Rucker, you have your hand up here.
Thank you. And I don't know if this lands with Guiding Principle 7, but what's coming up for me is I want students to understand that the experiences we all have with race are connected, cross race, home language, culture, or cultures, because I think there's danger in assuming that we are unicultured, I'll say. And I would love for us to capture a standard that makes it clear that we all, even white people, live under a system that oppresses everybody based on their race, and that system is called white supremacy, and that it advantages people who identify or have been identified as white at the expense of people of color or non-white people. But I would be remiss if we don't help students even understand how there's an anti-Indigenous kind of perspective that even exists in African American culture. Like, and in some ways, African American culture wouldn't exist without Indigenous folks, like cornbread. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think it's very important to honor what it means to be African American and African American people's contributions to this nation, which are irrefutable. But I also think I would find it a little counterintuitive if we did not really emphasize the contributions of various groups of color, starting with Indigenous folks. And I don't know if I'm being super clear, but I do have a little small reservation with that. Now, I don't want us to pivot away from African American history and culture. And then I do want us to be mindful of Black and African American don't mean the same thing. So we got to be like really consistent with that, because Black is a diasporic articulation, while African American is Black people specifically born here in the Americas. Like Obama and Harris are both Black, but they're not African American, for example. So just if we're going to talk about anti-racism, I think we got to make it bigger so we're not being myopic.
Okay. Lamar, do you want to say more about your comment here? Because I think that hits on some of the same, it builds on some of what Jessica was just ending on.
Sure. Because she's absolutely right. There have been many groups that have fought against different forms of oppression, mostly against white supremacy. All the people who have fought against white supremacy have not had the same story or the same experience. So if we want to emphasize both the conversation on power dynamics and shared humanity, we can show how these different groups were resisting in different ways and in different forms. Because this will let us see how different marginalized groups contributed to the overall narrative, not just being the oppressed people, but what they did to empower themselves as well as fight the system. And it will also help empower our discussions on power dynamics, because we're not just talking about the overall oppressive system. We're also focusing specifically on how these different groups resisted in different ways.
Sorry, I was muted. Other thoughts before we move on from this? Because it feels like folks are nodding and I'm seeing some affirmation in the chat. And I'm inclined towards Molly's question as well. That there's a lot of this that I think goes in 7. There's also some that I wonder if some of it, if any of it goes in 8. And then I'm also curious whether any of it needs to go into either 15 or 19. And 19 is a bigger discussion. So if there are places in here where you think that the kinds of wording you've just suggested makes sense, I would encourage you to use the suggesting mode and actually drop in some suggested text into 7. I'm going to move us to the next guiding principle so we can keep the conversation going. But please use the suggesting function in the top right-hand corner of your Google Doc. There's an option to either be suggesting or editing. If you use suggesting, it'll show up as that different color text so folks can see it, and it'll get tagged with your name so we can come back and revisit it. I want to come back to screen sharing here so I can move us to the next set of conversations. So guiding principle 10 was another one that we had left open before the public comment where there was some disagreement. It was also rated sort of middle of the pack, 3.42. It has very strong support from members of the state board. In particular, Emily Gassoy, our representative in Ward 1, is doing a lot of work with OSSE on their environmental learning standards. And so there's good support for this guiding principle from that aspect of the public. There were a few specific inline text suggestions that you'll see in the text itself. One was the question of, I guess there's been an update to the sort of reduce, reuse, recycle with a suggestion to refuse, reduce, recycle to sort of minimize consumption in the first place. A second piece of text feedback was to make sure that this wasn't just placed on the individuals as actors in the change of climate, but the recognition that civic responsibility extends to both individuals and corporations. So larger entities that have environmental impact that also need to take responsibility. Sally, in your comments before the meeting tonight, you also mentioned that we haven't actually used the term climate change in this guiding principle, but that perhaps we should name it explicitly and talk about the human impact of climate change. So my suggestion for guiding principle 10, given sort of the middle of the pack rating, the support from the state board, and some of these in-text suggestions, is that we adopt some of the in-text suggestions and we include guiding principle 10 in what we forward to the state board and to OSSE. Are there any questions or suggestions on this? I know there's lots of discussion still happening about 7 and 8 in the chat, so I don't mean to push us off that, but if folks have thoughts on this, if there's any opposition to the recommendation, I'd love to hear that. Otherwise, I will assume folks are okay with that. Okay. Seeing no opposition to number 10, folks seem comfortable with changes to 10. Move us on to the next one then. We can always come back if folks have epiphanies. But 19, I think, is going to take us down some of the same discussion roads as 7 is taking us down. So guiding principle 19 had the lowest rating. And I will say that it had one of the lowest ratings because there were some folks who were very opposed to guiding principle 19. And so they listed this as a strongly disagree. There were also folks who loved guiding principle 19 and had strongly agree. So there were definite divergent thinking on guiding principle 19. This is the principle around hard history. There were some clear opposition, and I've listed the comments there in a thread for folks who were opposed to the hard history guiding principle. There were some folks who liked the principle but had concerns about clarity and the complexity of what we were trying to include in one guiding principle. And then there were some concerns, both from the public and from the SISAC members, about the treatment of culture. And this, Sally, was the place I was noting that you also referenced culture. We have one insertion now in the anti-racist guiding principle, number 7, but it seems to also come up here. So I asked folks to take a good look at number 19, because again, here, I don't have a clear recommendation. There's a lot in 19 and folks had a lot of things to say. So take a minute and read through all that. And then let's hear folks' reactions to number 19 in light of the kinds of things you're still talking about for 7 and 8, because I think some of what we talked about for 7 might also affect number 19 here.
Jessica, I'm having a little hard time figuring out where the comments begin. What's the first one? Where does the thread begin? How does it start?
So if you go to guiding principle 19.
Oh, where it says guiding principle 19 had the most comments, is that where it starts?
Yep, if you click on American exceptionalism is where the opposition concerns begin.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'm going to keep my eye both on your chat as well as your participant list to see if folks have hands raised or have thoughts on this.
If I could just talk about the American exceptionalism, I feel like some of this language is emotionally fraught and not specific enough. So I wonder if we more clearly stated what we mean by American exceptionalism. I think lots of conversations that we've had as a group, I think we have a shared definition that might not be as clear to the larger public. And I wonder if maybe going through some of these more, I hate to say controversial because they're dear to my heart, but and maybe find more explicit language around this would make it a little less contentious. Does that make sense?
Yeah, say more about like, so one piece that people pulled out, and it was tricky because as I read through the public comment, I was a little torn and even had to try and help display it for all of you.
Yeah.
Because there's one comment that says hard history is redundant if we're already talking about anti-racism and the global perspective. Mm-hmm. And then you have another comment in support of that says we need to double down on hard history. Mm-hmm. And then a general comment in the preamble that said these standards don't go far enough to embody anti-racism.
Yeah.
And so it was tricky to try and figure out how to properly frame them for you all. So when you think about some of the things like, what do we mean when we're saying American exceptionalism?
Yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, so there's this one comment who's interpreting it is like, we should still strive for excellence, but that's not what American exceptionalism is to me, right? It's that whole idea of manifest destiny tied up with white identity. And so clearly that's not clear enough to the audience. If we have a shared definition of it, then we haven't made it entirely clear. And hard history is another one. I do, that's kind of a commonly used term, but maybe, what we mean is, we're not trying to traumatize children. We're not trying to recreate reenactments that sees headlines across the country, but we are trying to present a full and balanced history.
Yeah, can I jump in? Sarah, I agree with you,
Yeah.
the American exceptionalism. When I saw that comment, I thought, whoever made that comment about we should all be striving for exceptionalism does not have the same understanding we do. I mean, I think how I see it, it's an ideological underpinning that has shaped Americans' foreign policy, their domestic policy, and it's problematic. I don't know how else to articulate it, but Sarah, I totally agree with you. It seems like we have very different definitions than the general public or some of the general public.
So maybe we need to work that definition. So American exceptionalism as understood to be blah, 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 because there is an academic definition that I think we're relying on.
Yeah, Martin Seymour Lipset. He's a sociologist from the 60s who coined it. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Right. And yet the larger public reading this and who are asking for input might see it differently.
Great idea.
Lizzie, do you want to send to me or to us the person we should look to for that appropriate definition?
So I say that I use this definition, but I don't know if that's what you all would refer to. I mean, I think it's, this is how I teach it. He has a whole book, American Exceptionalism. So we teach as a starting point, and then obviously, we critique it. But I can definitely send that around. I don't know if that's helpful or where other people are pulling their sources from an American exceptionalism. Oh, okay. Jen just posted something.
Other thoughts on this? Go ahead, Laura.
I guess just the way I read some of those comments is just that there are some people who want to teach things the way that some places, unfortunately, still teach things, which is a very kind of America first kind of attitude. And I don't think it's due to a lack of understanding of American exceptionalism. I think it's because it's full support of the continued pushing of that concept as a way to kind of teach in our schools. So not that that means we should just disregard the comment, but at the same time, we should just disregard the comment. That's not how we want to go with it. And I'm hoping that from everything I've heard, we don't want to. So, hard history is controversial, right? Teaching for Change gets a lot of heat. There's a reason, when you put that, they send you postcards to put on your board. In DC, of course I can put it on the board, no one cares, but you might put it down on your board somewhere else. The administrator walks in and then they don't want to see it. So, yeah, I think hard history kind of triggers some people because it's a brand, right? In a sense, it's a program that's being, pushed by teachers who are trying to, in DC, what might be obvious to us and isn't obvious in some states in the way they write their standards. So I think that's why this one triggered people, because just the very term hard history. I think it's just, that's how it's going to be. I doubt much of it's coming internally from DC, if we're being real. I think a lot of it's going to be coming from outside people who care deeply about standards nationwide and are very concerned about places they view as liberal, taking a liberal stance, which I would just disagree with that, as a fundamental, but I think that's just how some people see it. I think it's just political.
I think there's definitely elements of politics to it, so I won't disregard that at all. I think that's true. I will also note that in pulling in some of the comments into the text, I left out some of the more, what I would call alarming aspects of what people wrote. There was a very long diatribe on a white child in DCPS who now won't speak to children in their class anymore because they were accused of being slave owners. And I thought, well, that really has no relevance to our standards discussion. So we're just going to leave that can go over there in the public comment piece. So I agree that I think there's some like personal politics behind it, but I do think that if we can get precise on what we mean here, we can also make sure that we're not misunderstood by folks. Fidel, you've got your hand up, so I want to come to you next.
Yeah, I think just like continuing along this line about like defining what these terms mean very specifically, I think like we need to shine a light on accessibility, just in language in general. I think so there's one level of it where we like need to make sure we're saying the same thing, right? When we say American exceptionalism, are we all saying the same thing? But I think there's also like, for these guiding principles and the standards themselves that will come out of them, we expect them to be commented on by the public. And we also like, when they are finalized, we want them to be something that parents can read, all parents, regardless of their education level, right? And I think like, that means we need to be a little bit more, we need to like challenge our accessibility when we use terms like this, like hard history, exceptionalism, Bloom's taxonomy. I read through the public comments from the Google Doc, and there were a couple comments that were just saying like, well, I don't know what this means. And like this language doesn't work for me, right? And I think we need like all of us in here, like we're all educators or like are very much engrossed in like the education/curriculum world. So it's like really easy for us to get caught up in a lot of the jargon and not notice that it is jargon. But I think we need to make some things a little clearer, because if we want this to actually be a democratic process, it needs to be, we need to get rid of a lot of the barriers to entry. And I think like there are a couple of like sort of like written barriers to entries here.
Yeah, that is really helpful feedback. And it was clear that a few folks called out, Lamar, you're exactly right. Educational bureaucrats, folks noting that they had a hard time understanding what we meant when we said. And in some ways it is because we're writing inside baseball. We're a group of educators and experts in the field writing for writers who are presumed to be educators and experts in the field. But if we want the standards document to be broadly accessible, that has its own problems. Let me ask a very high level question. Is there anyone who is opposed to advancing the ideas in Guiding Principle 19? Not seeing any opposition. So I think it sounds like what we need to do with 19 is clarify language, sort of take our own advice on precision of language that we wrote for the standards, that we should take our own advice in the guiding principles, and get clear about what we mean when we say these things. But it feels like this guiding principle is going forward. Second question on that front is, do all of these elements of inside Guiding Principle 19 hang together for you? So we've talked about American exceptionalism, teaching hard history, and then moving away from Eurocentrism. There's a question at the end of this around the issue of culture and how we're handling culture. So it feels like we need to clarify American exceptionalism, clarify hard history, but is there any concern or question around whether all of these elements hang together? Should any of them be pulled out and go somewhere else, or do they all best belong together as one common guiding principle?
In a way that I can't really articulate, it does feel like there's some, excuse me, some mixed messages in here. I guess I don't know really why. Sorry, I just choked. You know, why teaching hard history follows from, you know, a recognition of American exceptionalism, right? That just seems a little bit like a response to the opening paragraph. So I think that they're both important, but I guess now that you raise it, I wonder if they go together. I'm interested in others' thoughts about that.
Other thoughts on that? I mean, does American exceptionalism specifically link to hard history, or is that something that would belong in the preamble as something over and above the standards, or is it something that neatly ties together? I have not taught the teaching tolerance curriculum curriculum. So I defer to folks who are working with it and know more about whether it links together in a way that they belong in the same guiding principle or maybe need to go somewhere else.
Or does the teaching hard history belong up in 9?
I think American exceptionalism goes well with hard history, just because in terms of like concepts that we teach in social studies classes and history classes, like that are just very pervasive, that are taught like facts, like it's an opinion, like essentially, that like you need to be able to make an argument. It's a claim, like you make an argument for that you can support with like facts from like either side of it. But like I think we need to push the fact that it is a claim and not like, you know, a physical law of the universe. And I think like digging into that with hard history makes sense.
And building on what Fadal says, I think it's this idea of American exceptionalism that engendered so much of our hard history, right? And I would actually say that American exceptionalism then actually falls under the hard history, right? It's part of that umbrella, like one strand of truly understanding hard history is understanding the American exceptionalism that created this mindset that justified the oppression of others.
So it feels like this set of ideas is fine to folks in terms of how they hang together collectively, but that the precision of language and perhaps even the ordering of the wording of putting hard history first and having American exceptionalism underneath it might make more sense. So it doesn't feel like there's a conceptual problem with number 19, but that there is language work to be done on this. Am I accurately capturing what I'm hearing from folks? That we're advancing it, that the ideas are fine altogether, but that there's some language work to be done, including precision about what we mean when we say things.
Yeah, when I think about precision, I guess something that I hadn't really considered was really limiting the editorializing, because I know in lots of comments I've been quite candid. So, but no, like dropping, someone caught that word that we said, the sin of slavery, right? It's like, yeah, good catch. That's not really an appropriate word to use in state standards. So, I don't think we kind of want to water down the impact of what we're saying. So I just want to.
Karen, you got your hand up.
I just want to say that I think there's something powerful in keeping it separate and saying like to teach hard history is our job. And it's our job from K to 12. Because I'm just thinking about like teacher training programs. I'm thinking about, I mean, my history degree is from the University of Idaho. I did not learn history the way that I know to teach it today. And so I have had to go through a series of relearning to get to the point where I am comfortable teaching what we're calling hard history. So thinking about this as a document that gets placed in the hands of people who are coming from all different experiences and all different comfort levels with their own learning, it feels important to solidify that in DC, we teach hard history.
Got it. Okay. I am going to suggest then we move on to talk about a few more comments on a couple of additional guiding principles. And then when we loop back to sort of other thoughts or concerns, we're going to go ahead and talk about how to handle this language adjustment, not just on 19, but also on 7, to make sure that we get that to a place where folks are comfortable with it. Okay, so guiding principle 20 is the windows and mirrors guiding principle. And this had the lowest rating of all the guiding principles that were put out for public comment. There were lots of concerns around lack of clarity and lack of specificity. So what do we mean when we say windows and mirrors? I think some of this has to do with jargon as well, like the way we think about it may not have been clear to the public and so may not have made sense. What I would suggest here is that unless there is opposition from the SISAC on including Guiding Principle 20, that we include it and we focus on adding both clarity of language around what do we mean when we say windows and mirrors, and what exemplars could we offer to make sure that the writing committee knows what we mean when we say this. Reactions, thoughts on this here? Sorry.
For me at least, I didn't totally understand what windows and mirrors really meant until like last week. So I think like it would be helpful to define the term at least, so that whoever's at OSSE when they're looking at this doesn't have to look up and ask other people what this term means. I think we should probably define it and give more clarity. But understanding it, I do think it's important to have. But I'm also like, I think I rated this one kind of low because I wasn't entirely sure what was meant by it.
Thanks, Alex. Other thoughts on this?
I'll chime in a little bit here. Yeah, so it's interesting. I think two of the ones we've talked about are terms that are very involved with teaching tolerance, so which I think is something that probably a number of people on this committee are more familiar with. But like for the general public and the commenters, you know, windows and mirrors is probably a term that is more like education bureaucrat speech, it sounds like. But yeah, I mean, I would definitely say like, I like this idea. I think it's an important one to include, because I think my impression of what we were trying to do was to acknowledge with the mirrors idea that the curriculum and the standards, and therefore the curriculum is reflective of, like a mirror, reflective of the students' experiences, and that they see themselves in what they're learning about. And then the idea of the windows is that they're able to look through windows into the experiences of people in other places and other times. And that both of those things in some kind of balance would be important when writing standards, and that we wouldn't skew towards like too much towards one or the other, because there would be trade-offs there. But I don't think that we necessarily laid that out, and we could be clearer in the way that we write that.
Other thoughts or reactions here? Sorry, my cursor does not like having so many different screens to go back and forth between. Okay. Then I'm going to suggest that we go ahead with that recommendation, including the guiding principle, adding exemplars for clarity, but also really clarifying like what we mean when we say windows, what we mean when we say mirrors. This is what it would look like for a student to experience this in our standards and our curriculum. All right, open questions 2 and 3 have been troublesome for us for a few months now. And these were both sort of middle of the road rating from the public. Folks gave them both round 3.4. And here are the things that we got from the feedback. For open question 2, this was around disciplinary content and labeling disciplinary content and labeling themes in the standards. The basic theme of the feedback we got from both folks on the SISAC who wrote notes in the document and from folks in the public is that there's a lot going on in this guiding principle, and it might be too much. We may be trying to accomplish too much in one place. We seem to be trying to say that it's important to have disciplinary content in the standards beyond just history, geography. So we want economics content. We want sociology content. We want more content that is not just history. We also want it to be clearly labeled so that folks know if they're trying to make sure they're hitting points about economics, they know where to find it. But we also used this guiding principle to talk about labeling themes to assist in curriculum creation. And some of this came from a discussion we had about whether we should do the standards chronologically do the standards by grades, or we should do something more thematic with our standards. And we landed on not doing thematic, but on making the standards available for people to write curriculum that might be thematic. We also had a public comment from one educator, school leader, specifically around, like, I'm worried that this becomes a survey course in history, and could we not have more thematic units? So I think there's still an interest in that, but we're trying to do it all in one. My question here as a recommendation is, I think we could try to reduce the number of things we're trying to do in this guiding principle. So we could say, we care about disciplinary content in the standards, and we care that it's clearly labeled throughout the standards. And we could leave out the themes, because we have mentioned thematic curriculum and making the standards available for writing curriculum that fits a variety of school contexts in the preamble. We could add another statement in the preamble that goes to thematic curriculum. Or we could get rid of this guiding principle altogether, or we could put all of it in the preamble. So thinking about how to address this, I don't think this guiding principle as written now is helpful to accomplishing our goals, which is, I think these are still 3 goals we've got. Reactions to the recommendation. Should we reduce down to just trying to do the pieces about disciplinary content? Should we get rid of it altogether? Should we add something to the preamble that helps accomplish this? What are your thoughts on how to handle open question 2?
I think at minimum, it makes sense to decouple them and to, we have made some indication earlier about this sort of thematic approach. So if the point here is to give guidance about how to identify the disciplines, then yeah, I think that they are, I agree that they compete. So I guess I have a little ambivalence about, I kind of am okay with how they're handled in the current document. So but it's not something that I feel, super strongly about either. So I'm not going to fight for that. I'm just sort of weighing in on the side of, yeah, it does seem to make sense to decouple them.
Molly, can I ask you to say more about the comment you wrote there about having coding? Is it coding like disciplinary content, or is it coding on other themes, like some of the themes that are currently coded in the standards?
Disciplinary content is really, I'm trying to think. So like, I know when these standards come out, I'm going to get the task of, here are the 2nd grade standards, go figure out what teachers are going to teach, right? Like that's going to be a task that I get probably in the future. So I'm thinking, like, when that gets handed to me as a summer project, what is going to be helpful? I'm probably working with a committee of teachers, like what is going to be helpful to me and the 4 teachers I'm working with in creating units for our teachers. And I don't know that at least in elementary, I don't know if thematic codes are as important as making sure that, say, between K and 2, I've covered geography, world history, American history, civics, economics, right? Like I need to make sure that when I'm selecting units to teach, I can balance that over the course of children's educational experience, especially because at my LEA, we do longer, deeper units. So we do 1 social studies unit and 1 science unit per year per grade level. And I need to make sure that those are really deep and cover what they need to make sure kids get that breadth of experiences. So disciplinary, I think for me, disciplinary would be really helpful. I can't speak to like in high school what would be helpful, but yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you, Molly. Other thoughts on this? It looks like there's a couple votes for retaining disciplinary content as clearly labeled or coded.
I must say though, that one thing that makes it difficult for teachers, parents, everybody is when like the number letter coding of standards gets really, really long. So like when you think about the Common Core math standards, there's, 3 OA D8, like they just get very long, and being able to remember, oh, like what is that? If you just have that on something, remember what it is can be a little bit difficult. So just, that's why I'm not sure if having themes along with disciplinary is like actually helpful, because it would just get so many letters and numbers in so many places.
So it sounds like simpler is also better while providing enough information to identify the disciplinary comment. Scott?
Yeah, and I also don't know if the coding needs to be in the name of the standard or if it just needs to be noted. So I'm thinking, right, so if I'm looking at a set of second grade standards and it says like 2.1 through 2.4 are geography standards and 2.5 through 2.8 are the history standards, like even just some sort of denoting like that can be helpful. I'm not exactly certain.
Right now, they're not in the identifying number of the standard. They're in a parenthetical sort of G for geography or whatever at the end of the standard statement. I mean, I don't know that we have to give them guidance about how, certainly given that these will find their way out into the world in some probably different format than the printed version that the standards before did, that there's probably ways to sort of color or I mean, that's kind of a challenge for them in terms of how it sits on a platform or what have you. But I think that what Molly's saying, and I'm finding myself, I mean, I like I said, I'm not in the classroom, but I think it's very helpful. And even, standards are documents that are studied and to some degree have, professional development value to them, and being able to see that, that a standard, that having that a disciplinary coding there, I would think is somewhat helpful, for teacher, as you say, when you're developing a unit, you can see that you've got each of these different disciplines working together. But in many ways, it's also, helpful. I would think helpful for a teacher to be able to see that it's what discipline that particular standard has been sort of pegged to.
Karen, does that align with your comment in the chat? Like, is the discipline labeling going to work given the kind of bridge you're looking for?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I think that like when I think about some of the themes that we are talking about and these themes that we want to be very present, like power dynamics, if I could figure out how to search, I teach 12th grade, right? So I'm at the end of the line. If I can figure out how to search what they've learned in classes on that theme to me, then I can help bridge and connect all along the way and say, oh, remember in 9th grade when we were looking at this, and remember in 11th grade when you saw this, right? Like I can help thread things a bit better. And I feel like that is kind of missing in what we currently have, which is why often my students are like, classes are so disconnected. Like how are they related? And so figuring out at least maybe it's a elementary set that gets sort of looked at in one way, a middle school set in one way, and a high school set in another way, so that coding makes sense. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. Do you think though, given that we have a note in the preamble that talks about the standards needing to be organized in such a way that it's cognizant of the different curriculum and school like educational models that exist within the district, and that the standards could be useful for that. So like, would that be enough for us to then talk with the standards writers when they come back with a draft to say, hey, this draft is great. We still wish there was some sort of list of themes at the elementary, middle, and high school level with concurrent standards. So like the theme of power dynamics, here are some current standards. Here are what this looks like for military presence or military occupation, that maybe having that noted in the preamble is enough. Okay. So for 20, I'm going to suggest we go to focusing on bullet 1 and 2 here and taking a look at the text in the preamble and seeing if there's a way to further emphasize the need for there to be themes noted or addressed in the standards in a way that assists in curriculum creation. Sorry for open question 2. I said 20, but I meant open question 2. Okay, we have one more. Open question 3. There was very little public comment on this guiding principle around the C3 framework. There was a lot of internal CISAC conversation on this dynamic. And so I'm very curious to see where you all would like to land, because we don't have any feedback from the public on this element, this question about disciplinary inquiry using the C3 framework. So the language that is in open question 3 now is compromise language. It is language that was worked from previous comments that folks wrote about the C3, and we could do that. Scott Abbott also has some compromise language in one of his comments, and we could also pull that in here. Or we could say, we could not agree on this, and we can transmit this to OSSE as an unresolved point of discussion. We could say, the committee discussed the use of the C3 framework at length and did not arrive at a conclusion. The one thing I want the group to understand is that if we do that, you are essentially passing the responsibility and passing the authority to decide whether and how to use the C3 framework to the writing committee. So in failing to take a position on it, we give that opportunity to someone else, and that may be fine. You may say, like, we don't really know, and so we want to leave that to the writers to decide. But I want to know where folks land on that, because again, the public didn't give us any insights on this. This is decidedly sort of a game of inside baseball among members of the CISAC. So thoughts on the C3 framework, open question 3, how it's worded, and what you want to do with it.
I just had an idea. Did we skip by, and I don't certainly need to visit it, but was there anything that was yet unresolved about the relative weight of content and skills? Because in some ways, this reference to the C3 framework and the particular skills, analytical skills of critiquing and analyzing arguments and so forth, are the historical and analytical skills, right, that we speak to. So maybe if the board wants to see something about utilizing the C3 framework, which maybe it's referenced there as an example of I mean, I don't have that particular guiding principle in front of me, but maybe it's referenced as where we draw from, or where we would encourage them to draw from as they are thinking about those historical skills and analytical skills.
We do that already in open question 1, the skills and content standards to ensure adequate attention to both. This was rated 3.5 by members of the public. They generally liked this guiding principle. And we had coded it green amongst ourselves because we had reached consensus that this was important. We do note in there organizing skills by anchor standard, a la the Common Core or C3 framework, can help with vertical alignment. And otherwise, the only feedback we got from the public was that people felt knowledge and skills both mattered, and that they wanted to make sure that we did not over or underweight knowledge or skills in any particular grade level, as skills were often sort of forefronted in the elementary grades, where knowledge should now sort of carry equal weight. But people generally liked open question 1, rated it well, and I think the question here is more pervasive. It's not about whether skills and knowledge get sort of equal weight across the grades. It's about how the standards document is framed. Scott, I know you feel really strongly about the C3, so do you want to say more about that here?
Sure. I think the way that I put a revision there, as you mentioned, that I think just gets a little bit more accurately towards like the way that we're using the term, for example, inquiry design model is not quite accurate. Like that's not, that term doesn't appear in the C3 framework. That was something that was come up with later as a way to implement the C3 framework. So I tried to make that language shift. So I'm not sure if that's the way that it's written in the comment there, maybe if that's clearer. I suspect that, like we were talking about with hard history and the windows and mirrors, this is a little bit of just education like terminology that the general public would be less familiar with. But I would say within like the social studies education community, the C3 framework is something that, you know, a lot of people is well known and is you know, has been used by more than 20 states as kind of a keystone of their standard revision process. And so I do think that I don't think Mike's here tonight, but I think Mike would back me up on this point that I know we've both done a lot within DCPS and Friendship to kind of use C3 as the kind of a touchstone of what we're doing. I think to Barbara's question about like, how does this relate to like the content and the skills, like the way that we think about the C3 framework, there are 4 dimensions, and they sort of, dimension 2 is where you would find the content, but because of political considerations, the C3 framework doesn't get as specific as, you know, I think we do in our state standards. And so the way that we've thought about it is sort of wrapping dimensions 1, 3, and 4 around the content, so that you have this sort of like, you know, inquiry process that the grade level content standards lay out what the inquiry is about, but the C3 framework would provide us with the updated thinking about how to reframe those history and historical, or what do we call them before, the historical and social
skills and yeah.
Right. I think the C3 framework is just sort of like, it is the field's best thinking in a more current sense, because it's 15 years later. So I don't know.
I'd still be confused. They seem to me, they seem to, I don't know, I'd still be confused.
Confused by what though? Sorry.
So I'm trying to toggle down between these, the open question 3 suggests that we want them to use the C3 framework, which you're saying provides this way of nesting content into a you know, this sort of skills framework. And I guess that's what I'm not comfortable with that.
Go ahead, Scott.
So, sorry, so let me clarify. I was just talking about how we are using the C3 framework currently within DCPS. Like what I mean in terms of the standards is that I think that the language of the C3 framework, the C3 framework is not a set of standards. It is a framework for state standards. So like the design of it is to, you know, drive a set of standards that are inquiry based and that use kind of like the most up-to-date thinking about how we can break down skills in a sort of grade band specific way that would help prepare students to engage in inquiry. So I guess my point with C3 framework is I would very much want the standards writers to be familiar with the C3 framework, to look at it, to be using that as a way to think about how to update the standards. I don't think I would get more specific than that at this stage. Like, I think that's what my comment was trying to get us towards.
I see at least one agreement on Scott's suggested language for OQ3. Any other thoughts? Agreement, opposition, desire to just eliminate this and let the writing committee decide? Get another vote in favor of Scott's language. Another opposition. Okay. Barbara and Laura, do you feel strongly enough about your dislike or confusion about the C3 to say that you don't feel comfortable with this being in the guiding principles we advance?
Personally, I do. I mean, I don't have an objection to indicating that it's that it's a document that they can, that they can refer to that might have some useful, some useful construct. But as everything that I have read, and I've read them a lot, puts the emphasis, even the dimension 2, which is applying disciplinary concepts and tools, it suggests that that's a skill, and so to me, it puts the emphasis in the it tilts the guiding principles more heavily toward skills than the content itself. And I worry enough about that anyway, because I think that's, I worry about it for a living as it relates to English language arts. And I think that we've done a really nice job in the document of suggesting, how important content is, and there's a lot there to navigate. And I just feel that it's sending a wrong signal about the importance of that content.
I think, to me, just maybe further mirroring what Scott said verbally about it being like a reference, but not really a guide. Like, I don't have a problem with using words like different verbs, right? Instead of saying describe all the time, going with construct, critique, analyze, etc. Like, all that seems fine. But I agree. I find it to be a very formulaic way of looking at skills. And I don't view social studies as a formula. I view it as an art. And I get that there's a lot of overlap between those things and how you apply it. And it's all, so that's why I say it is kind of like personal, like, 'cause this is not my style. Not that I'm like opposed to inquiry, but like, just, I don't think about it quite in that formulaic sort of way. So,
okay.
And I do get concerned that it can oversimplify if we don't kind of make it clear, kind of like Scott said, that it is like a guide that could then be used in a more curricular sort of way, but maybe not necessarily for standards, but that, right, recognizing it exists, I don't have a problem with that, but making it clear that it shouldn't be like, follow this and loop everything together the way they do. Like, that would concern me.
Yeah, and just to, I mean, I'm comfortable with what.
Barbara, I want to give Jessica a chance to speak, and then I just have to be mindful of our time because we have a couple more things to get through. Jessica?
Mine was just a question about skills, and this might not be the time because of time, but the way I think about skills is that they're transferable and they can be used to access content. And it just sounds, based on like what Scott described, and I don't know enough, that this could be a way to guide the standards such that students are building skills that help them access content across discipline, but maybe I don't understand. So that I just needed clarification.
Daniel, you had your hand up.
I guess I'm a little bit confused because it seems like we're prescribing what content students should learn, but getting kind of cagey about how they should go about it. So I'm just confused, kind of like why we feel comfortable saying what content everybody should learn, but don't want to make really any statement about how it should be taught. And I feel like the whole point of standards is kind of standardize how we do things.
So
otherwise, we would all just kind of do whatever we want.
I want to offer a suggested compromise. The folks who like Scott's proposed language seem to really like Scott's proposed language. And I think what I'm hearing from you, Barbara, is a concern that having it as a separate guiding principle overemphasizes skill versus content, where we've tried to really dig in on some content in the document. So what do we think about taking the language from Scott's and adding it to the guiding principle that talks about knowledge and skills to describe how we think skills ought to be addressed in the standards? So we wouldn't change anything about the current wording of that guiding principle, but we would add on a new paragraph to it. And the new paragraph we would add would be Scott's suggested language in the comment around standards should support an inquiry-based instructional approach. The C3 framework makes the case that inquiry is at the heart, and goes through a little bit more. So this would go into guiding principle number, open question 1, and would be added in as another paragraph. If not, I'll be honest, I'm listening, and we will not have time to resolve this tonight. So I think that leaves us in a place of, if that compromise is not workable and folks don't have another suggested compromise, I think we land on not resolving this and leaving it as an open question for the writing committee to decide.
I would be comfortable if it were integrated in a way that if it would be possible to do it in a way that wouldn't dominate, I'm just suggesting that there might be a little bit of what's there that could be merged with his language. Because otherwise that open question number 1 really is about skills and not about content and skills, the appropriate sort of weighting of both. But I think that's a good solution to put it there if folks want it to stay.
Okay, looks
Yeah,
like
I mean,
Karen's
I would be
okay
fine
with
with that too.
Scott's okay with that. Lamar's okay with that. Sarah's okay with that. So that's what I'm going to propose, is we'll pull that up there, and you'll see where we talk about wording in a second that there'll be a few more times for folks to help with wording.
Jessica.
You muted yourself, Jessica.
Sorry, I said some really nice things in there. I said the last thing I wanted to talk about with respect to public comment was that there were a few other public suggestions. And on this, I mostly just need to sort of gauge where folks feel about this. There was a suggestion that we need to include some sort of principle on personal economics and finance. This has come up again and again in DC recently around a high school graduation requirement on personal finance. One of our student reps for the state board, who is now off at college, talked about this issue of that was a real lack she found in her high school experience, was never really getting access to lessons about taxes, mortgages, rents, how you think about personal economics and personal finance. So that was one suggestion. Reactions, thoughts on the issue of personal economics and finance. Is that something that is lacking in our standards and needs to be there, or no? Fadal?
Well, 2 things. One, I think it depends on how much we're including economics at all. If we think economics is part of this, I think it should be. The second part of it is, like, if we are responding to what the public wants and like make sure there's truly a democratic process, I think it's actually pretty important. I can't think of a curricular ask that I've heard from communities all across the country more often than for personal finance in high school. I've heard it so much. And it's something like parents ask for, students ask for, my own students have asked for it. And communities ask for it. I just think it's something that, like, if DC wants to like set a model and set a standard for something, like, it would, I don't know, it seems like something that would be pretty important. It's also just something we need in general. But yeah, we do need to ask ourselves the question, like, is it within our purview? If it is within our purview, I say we definitely push it. But if not, that's another question.
Becca, you're asking that question. Is it within our purview? Say more.
So I agree that, like, there are connections to economics, but to me, like, I don't think this is really, I don't think personal finance helps you understand, like, IB calls social studies individuals and societies, and I really like that. I don't think it helps you understand yourself better. I don't think it helps you interact with other people better. I don't think it helps you understand, like, society writ large better. I think it is incredibly important. I think DC absolutely needs to find a way to integrate it. I don't know, especially given that we don't seem to have a required economics course in high school. And even if we did, I don't think, I think it's the job of the SBOE to think about where does it land and what does that requirement look like, but I don't think that's ours.
Okay. Fidal, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, just to like push back on that a little bit, I actually do think it's pretty important for like understanding like the nature of like how power works and systems work in both this country and globally. Like how it also is like a window into student engagement to like talk about these things as well. Like how my taxes work, how like getting a loan works, like how like all of these things like very much are integrated into everything that we talked about within our guiding principles. And I think, so I just want to push that there, that there are definitely arguments that like this is very relevant to social studies and everything that we're trying to talk about.
Yeah. Sally, unfortunately, high school graduation requirements are decidedly not part of our purview in this conversation, so I can't really go there, but it looks like Karen Hopkins has offered to draft some language on this. So it feels like there's enough interest in this that there is a desire to consider including economics as well as this piece of personal economics and finance in our principles. So I'm going to defer to Karen Hopkins. I would love to take you up on that offer for drafting it. I want to sort of quickly go through these last three because I want to then make an explicit ask of the committee, because we have used far more of our time on conversation tonight than we unfortunately had. Another complaint folks offered in the comments was that they felt like there was actually too little attention given to government and civics, where there was a principle on civic identity. There was not a lot of mention in the guiding principles. We did get very clearly from some of the public feedback, folks' level of confusion over what standards are going to be revised and what this document was. So what I am not as clear on is whether folks were concerned that there was very little attention to government and civics in what they thought might be standards documents versus guiding principles. But that's another question for all of you, is whether you agree that we've paid enough attention to government and civics. Two other points, and these are both at the bottom of the guiding principles document. There was a comment about the connection between evolution of technology and human behavior and whether that merited more of a call out. And then another on the more explicit attention to the connections between humans and community. And Rebecca, I think that goes a little bit to the way you just described IB talking about the concept of the social studies, that folks wondered about whether we had drawn an explicit enough thread there. Here's what I think we need to do in order to get these guiding principles into the hand of the SBOE on December 16th. We want to vote on these on December 16th because we need to get these into the hands of OSSE for their writing committee. So that's sort of the time crunch here. However, we need to make sure that you all are comfortable with advancing the guiding principles. We clearly have a lot of wording clarity to still work through. And I think that is possible, that we can do that asynchronously over documents. But I want to make sure before we go on, are there other remaining questions or concerns that folks on this committee have before we say the set of guiding principles as we've talked through them tonight? And I'll just recount, we're talking about making a narrow statement about the need for standards to be designed to be measured by both teachers, schools, and the state. We're talking about clarity of language in principles 7, 19, where we're also working on limiting editorialism, 20, being specific about windows and mirrors, open question 2, narrowing to our top 2 bullets, and for open question 3, pulling Scott's recommended language into the guiding principle open question 1. If we were to do all those things, are there other outstanding questions or concerns folks on the committee want to say, I have a concern before I advance this to the board? Alex.
Sorry, that was from our earlier point.
Okay. No worries. So I'll ask the question in a different way. Are folks okay with this being the set of guiding principles that moves to the state board for their adoption on December 16th? I'm seeing general nodding, assent, a couple thumbs up. People seem happy. Excellent. Okay, here. This is exciting. Fantastic. So with that, I want to go back to the deck for one more minute. Lots of you had talked about the desire for exemplars and non-exemplars, and here's what I would recommend we do. I think that belongs in a companion document that would go off to OSSE for use by their writing committee to align with these guiding principles, that we would pull from SISAC members' feedback on the individual worksheets you gave us, and we have this large Excel spreadsheet of all your great thoughts on specific examples. And then we would ask for advisors from this committee to review exemplars and non-exemplars before we send them off with the guiding principles to OSSE. What do you think about that process, so that they would not be in this document, but that they would be accompanying once we got the language here precisely right? That's a process that could happen after the 16th, before we send this off to OSSE, and we could ask for volunteers. See a couple thumbs up. I don't see any hands. I don't see any concerns being raised in the chat. Okay, looks like folks are good with that. Okay, moving on to the next steps then. So here are things we need to know, and I want to give just a minute in case Justin or Siobhan has anything to say here. OSSE's Technical Writing Committee application is going to go live this Friday. And it will be open until January 15th. We don't have the link yet, but once we have it, we'll share it with this committee. Justin or Siobhan, is there anything else you want to say to the SISAC about that writing committee application? Anything that may be new or changed since we last spoke?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. No, the application remains as is. I think we received a few pieces of feedback that we incorporated. So that will be in the LEA look forward, which some people receive. Others may not, but we will ensure that Jessica gets the link to email it out to this group on Friday. So we're excited for that. Of course, we encourage and want your applications for that. We're looking for a great group of educators. And I just want to again say a huge shout out to you all for the time commitment, the robust conversation. I've been listening in at every meeting and diligently taking notes, and you all have my wheels turning in my head. So tremendous gratitude from Justin and I, and from OSSE for your work around this. We're excited to see these standards come to life, and it could not have been done without the work that you all have done over the past few months. And Jessica, thank you for your leadership in this work as well.
Yeah, thank you, Siobhan. One quick question. I know folks raised questions last time about the time commitment, and I just wanted to check, like, that's still the same, that's all as was explained last time?
Yes, it's looking like 15 to 20 hours a month. Sorry, my kids are home. 15 to 20 hours a month is the expected, with potentially an increase around the summer months. So that is remaining pretty consistent. We also heard you all in regards to the time commitment without compensation. So Justin and I are still knocking on doors, trying to see what we can do around that. And we hope to have some clarity in the coming weeks around that piece as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Siobhan.
Yes, certainly.
That is going to happen starting this Friday, and we'll make sure you all get the link and can share it. The state board will vote on the resolution on December 16th. And so if you have the chance to tune in, if not, we will be sure to send you the link to the YouTube where you can watch your guiding principles advance in all their glory. And then just so you have a sense of what we're thinking about in the year ahead, I mentioned this at the start of tonight. We'd like to keep in touch with you all next year. We're planning to have 4 meetings over the course of the year, likely 1 in March, 1 in June or July, 1 in September. We'll reach out in the new year to sort of set up ideal times for those meetings. We're thinking each of those will be an hour, and we'll think about the right topics to talk about. I really like the idea of maybe making one of those about the concept of assessment, and certainly one about rolling out standards, because I know you all have a lot of thoughts about curriculum, rollout, assessment, etc. And then planning for a 2-hour meeting, tentatively scheduled for December, for once OSSE has a draft, for you all to engage with, review, see if it aligns with the guiding principles, and participate in supporting public comment and outreach. So that's what the road ahead looks like. Laura, you had a comment about how we hold OSSE accountable, how we're working with OSSE going forward. A lot of that is going to happen once we get the draft back, because our charge is to say, do the draft standards match the guiding principles? Yes or no? Where they don't, what's our feedback back to OSSE? And then what do we expect for them to do to sort of reconcile things? But if you have other questions, we're certainly happy to hear them. What I think Alex and I will do, at this point, I don't have any more information than that, Laura. We don't have discussions about drafts in progress or about other check-ins, but I certainly think we should talk more about that once the writing committee is assembled, and make sure that we check in on that at our March, June, and September meetings. What Alex and I are going to do is go ahead and make some preliminary cleanup based on the things we talked about in tonight's meeting. We will reach out to you via email for some asynchronous support to just check in with us, make sure the language looks the way you expect it to. And we'll do that over the course of the next week before we get to the December meeting, so that what we are advancing to the state board is what you all are comfortable with and have seen. I will use my last minute to thank you profoundly for all of the hours you have put in. We counted. You've put in more than 20 hours of your volunteer time since you all assembled as a group. I'm very, very thankful for all of the push you've given us, for the comments, for the suggestions, for the work that's going forward on behalf of DC kids and teachers and our schools. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all a few times in the new year. And I do hope that at least one of those times we'll be back in person. That is my greatest hope in 2021, is to actually meet some of you all in the real world, as it were. Thank you all. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your willingness to compromise and to push this all forward. Have a great night.